Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. I'm a journalist and host with CPAC, and as I like to always tell my American friends, not that CPAC. The Cable Public Affairs Channel, so think C-SPAN with a parka, based in Ottawa. So our panel, I'm going to begin it by reminding you of what we heard from Peter Van Prague earlier as the conference got underway, that this year, the Halifax International Security Forum is very much focused on democracy, and that without democracy, there is no security. And the topics that you have heard talked about and will continue to hear talked about through the course of this weekend are the secret components and the characteristics that buttress, build, and grow democracies and democratic movements. So that in mind, our topic for this discussion is Democracies Deliver Dollars. And to help answer what that means and to discuss what that means, we're joined by an esteemed panel, beginning right beside me here, Minister David McGuinty, Canada's Minister for National Defence. Beside him, Minister Ruben Brekelmans, Minister of Defence for the Netherlands. Ms. Nancy Southern, the Chair and CEO of ATCO Limited. And beside her, U.S. Senator Chris Coons, Senator for the state of Delaware. Thank you for being part of the program. So I will go down the line and ask what it means to each of you when you hear that phrase, democracies deliver dollars. But I'm also going to get the audience prepared here because we will reserve a lot of time in this discussion to have you ask your questions of the people here, not so much me. You don't really want to know what I have to say about these things, but we will turn to you. So perhaps start formulating your questions. But when you hear the phrase, Minister McGuinty, I'll begin with you, democracies deliver dollars, what comes to mind?
I think the first thing that I think about is that a sovereign and secure country requires a sovereign and secure economy. I think that here in Canada on the defense front, we've decided to shift things. We've decided to be a bit more direct in intersecting our Canadian Armed Forces needs, our defense needs, our equipment needs with our economy. Something we traditionally have not done as forthrightly, which is why we're giving rise to a new defense industrial strategy for the country where we are trying to intersect on a couple of fronts. What can we produce well in Canada? What do we need here for our own sovereignty? And what can we sell or share with like-minded allies? So I think about that. I also think about another angle on democracies delivering dollars. If we want to maintain the support of our populations, they need to be more than passengers on the journey when it comes to, for example, financial support for the Canadian Armed Forces. I like to think, Michael, that the Canadian citizenry are shareholders in the project and they understand what we're trying to do. So we need to work carefully. We need to make sure that they're with us, that they understand. They do because they've given us the support. So those are two ways in which I look at that democracy deliver dollars title. And we're hoping as we build this, it will continue, of course, to create jobs and stimulate the economy and make of defense one of our top 3 industrial sectors.
Minister Brekelmans?
I think the key theme of this security conference is the rivalry or the battle between democracies and autocracies. And I think the only way for democracies to win is if we are able to generate enough welfare and if we are able to, in that sense, to deliver dollars. That's the only way that we can outwin in the longer term. If I relate it to defense, I very much agree that we need a strong defense in order to secure our economy and to make sure that we are able to generate dollars. I usually do not talk about defense expenditure, but about defense investment, because it is in the longer term an investment in our economy. But also, if you look at what we need to invest in, it's not only in the traditional equipment, not only in bullets, for example. It's also about innovation, about new technologies, about investing in AI, in quantum, things like that. So I think there could be a lot more spillovers from the defense investments to other sectors of the economy. One final point that I would like to make, I would like to add the word together. because we, as the Netherlands, we are relatively small. We call ourselves mid-sized. And there is a lot that we can do with our industry in terms of innovation. Our semicon industry is leading in the world. But there are also many things that we cannot produce. And we need to work much more closely together internationally in order to ramp up our production and to strengthen our innovation. And I think Canada is a perfect example of that. My colleague has been reaching out to me and also to others to see how can we work together. And now that when our defense budgets are going up, there's also a huge pressure from our population to say you need to spend those euros, in my case, in your own country. But if we keep doing that, then we will not create the necessary scale to scale up. And I think I can explain to a Dutch citizen that I buy from Canada if Canada is also buying something from the Netherlands. And that simple way of working together, creating those win-win situations, those investment packages, in some way we are not able to do that enough. And I think that is a task that every Minister of Defense has in order to make sure, okay, we not only need to strengthen our own industry, but how can we do this together? We need to strengthen our defense together, but also our industries together.
Ms. Southern?
Michael, I think, well, from the industrial or commerce perspective, democracies deliver dollars because investment looks for stability. And democracies provide institutional reliability, regulatory transparency, provides for accountability and legitimacy. And I think those characteristics of democracies are what attracts capital. And certainly tyrannical regimes also look for those types of investments. When you look at Australia, they've figured out, I believe, in quite a sophisticated way how to balance their exports to China while not allowing Chinese investment in their critical infrastructure. And they've done that in a way that's been accommodating for business and building of investment within Australia, while sensitively not disturbing their relationship with a tyrannical regime. The other thing that democracies provide for is protection for citizens and companies. And that's very important. When we look at investments around the world, it is only in democracies. And democracies have lots of warts, and there's always tension between regulators and policy and investment. But it's how we build prosperity. It's how we actually create a standard of living for the people in the countries that are democracies, where we can continue to strive for improved productivity, improved prosperity, and search for affordability. But I do want to touch on affordability because that was talked about quite a bit. Affordability is absolutely important. Efficiency is important. But it is not affordable to continue to develop new technologies. It is not affordable in the sense of how citizens and the body politic are talking about affordability. It costs money. It requires investment. And to recover that investment takes some time. And there's an accountability on all of us, whether it's athletes, artists, the judiciary, constabulary, our militaries, the body politic, the body commerce, to be accountable to each other in harmonizing how we look at development alongside citizens' prosperity and productivity.
Senator Coons?
So democracy delivers dollars. I take it as democracies deliver hope, deliver opportunity, deliver development in the way that Nancy was just saying, prosperity to our citizens and constituents. In the 25 years after the Berlin Wall fell, global extreme poverty was cut in half. something like 1.5 billion people who were struggling in abject poverty were elevated to middle-class standards. Now, how that was accomplished was roughly divided between the PRC, which elevated hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty, and the rest of the world. MIT did a study looking at the former Warsaw Pact countries, at countries that had been authoritarian, and concluded that on average there's a 20% increase in GDP as you move towards democracy. Or just take two of the concrete examples we've spent a lot of time talking about this weekend. Ukraine versus Russia, Taiwan versus the PRC. Taiwan, this tiny island of 23 million people, is the world's leading semiconductor chip innovator and manufacturer in partnership with countries like the Netherlands and Korea, Japan, and the United States. Compared to China, which has tried desperately to develop their own indigenous chip manufacturing capacity that has failed after investing billions and billions, because freedom unlocks innovation. The ability to do better for yourself and your family, and then to keep it and protect it, and the ability to worship as you want, speak as you want, petition the government as you want. What freedom brings is also excitement and energy and innovation. The opposite is what we see in Russia, for example, compared to Ukraine, both blessed with a lot of natural minerals, with highly sophisticated, educated populations. But the Russian economy has gone sideways now for decades, as Ukraine before the war, and frankly, in some ways during the war, has shown incredible innovation. They are still sovereign and free really only because of their will and their innovation. Now, the reverse is not true. Development doesn't necessarily bring democracy. Many of us made the mistake in the 90s of thinking if China got richer and richer, inevitably the rising middle class of the PRC would demand democracy. Where an authoritarian state is powerful enough, they can see a rise in standards of living, yet not freedom. And the surveillance capitalism now empowered by social media and AI and continuous monitoring makes that more likely. So the last panel was partly about, as AI accelerates technological change and innovation, unlocks the possibilities because of huge increases in productivity, of dramatic increases in prosperity, we have to continue the work we've long done of ensuring there isn't a vast digital divide. The Belt and Road Initiative by China challenged the West, and in particular the United States, to get back involved in delivering prosperity and opportunity in the developing world. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but there's more we should do. I think shutting down USAID abruptly and the West pulling back from investing in development is causing us real harm. And I think there are ways we can re-engage that are more efficient, more streamlined, but actually also lead to prosperity for emerging and developing democracies around the world.
I'm going to jump off on that point. I do want to hear more about initiatives, because you certainly started a couple of on your own, Senator. But when we think about democracies delivering dollars, you all allude a little bit to prosperity, affordability, the citizen buy-in, making sure that they're more than just passengers on this journey. So connect the dot then. How do you make sure that these dollars actually do deliver democracies, that they actually do buttress democracy? Because if you take affordability as an example, affordability is more than being able to pay all your bills at the end of the month. It's also aspirational. Yeah. And so if the next generation doesn't feel as if their aspirations will be met, that in of itself becomes a challenge to democracy on the home front. So how do you make sure that the dollars invested actually buttress and foster democracy for generations to come? I'll begin with you, Minister.
I think we need to redouble our efforts in showing measurable progress. I think of my 4 adult kids, their generation, work with a lot of young people who tell me they feel hopeless and helpless. I think one of the areas where we've fallen short is on that aspirational front. We often set very high aspirational targets that we know we cannot meet. And I'll illustrate, as someone who spent 10 years in sustainability, I have a view that the international community, well-meaning, good faith, goodwill, predicated on good science, has set in process a Conference of the Parties process which has continued to move out targets which the folks who are endorsing know are extremely difficult to achieve. That is not helpful in terms of proving that the democratic process of setting targets and achieving them is showing progress, that people will see that their investments are intersecting with democratic strengthening. We look at what happened last week at the COP conference. I don't know if there were any heads of state there. A few, but I think that one of the things we have to be cautious about now in this next iteration of showing that democracies work for us is to show measurable improvement. And it's not a bad thing that we're hopeful and that, I mean, let me put it this way. When my kids were younger, I would talk to them at nighttime, putting them in the bed, and I would tell them about the way the world ought to be. And then in the morning over breakfast, we would talk about the world is. What I call the world of the ought and the world of the is. And I think we've got to be careful in projecting aspirational targets. I had the same conversation with the Secretary General of the UN. I love the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I love them all. They read like poetry. Not quite Shakespearean, but okay. No iambic pentameter, but good. It's just that as a legislator and as a young person looking at these goals, I look at these and I say, what exactly would you like me to do with these? How do I implement this in such a way as to show traction, implementability, operationalization, and outcome? I think we've got to be more careful on that front.
I pass on to anyone else, and take it as you will. You know, I use the home front, but it is also democracies of our allies and those who challenge our allies.
I think your question at this point in time is too positive. For me, the question is not how can we strengthen democracy, but how can we protect and keep democracy? Because we do see in many parts of the world, but including in Europe, there are many anti-democratic tendencies. And if you look at all the indices that there are, the level of democracy is going down. And I'm very afraid about what's happening in Ukraine now. Because if we let Ukraine down, then also anti-democratic tendencies can come to power again. It plays into the Russian narrative. The same is true with other countries, especially in the eastern part of Europe. We in the Netherlands, this year we celebrate 80 years of freedom, thanks to the United States, thanks to Canada, who liberated us. So we have a solid and long democratic tradition also before that, but we celebrated now for 80 consistent years. Many other countries in Europe, more on the eastern side, they only had slightly over 30 years of democracy. So in those countries, the anti-democratic forces are much stronger. And you don't need to go back a long time to bring back some of the sentiments that I think were never there. You know, life wasn't better in the eastern part of Europe more than 30 years ago. But if those countries are let down by us, by countries in the west of Europe, United States, Canada, then you see that the far-right movement, for example, is gaining traction. So I think we sometimes overestimate also the stability of, for example, Europe. And we need to work on this every day to show countries that are part of NATO, that are part of the EU, that they can count on us, that we are an alliance, that we protect each other whatever happens. But also Ukraine is a litmus test, I think. And we need to make sure that we also keep showing Ukraine that we support them. Of course, we all understand that compromises need to be made and then at some point you need to negotiate. But fundamentally, we need to show that to people in Europe who have fought for 4 years, made huge sacrifices in order to protect their freedom and democracy, that we stand with them.
Anybody want to respond?
May I, Chris? I think that I agree with what you're both saying. I believe that as leaders in democracies today, we have the entire constituents, we have oftentimes forgotten about our responsibilities. And our responsibilities is to talk to each other. And it's one thing to say we're going to stand up for Ukraine. But how are we going to do that? We have to understand what you're trying to solve for. We have to understand what Ukraine is trying to solve for. We have to understand what NATO's trying to solve for. We don't have enough munitions. We do not have the technology. And how are we going to get that? To make sure that we put Russia on the ground, to their knees. How do we do that? We all have to be in this. And we have to have the conversations. And trust has been brought up several times throughout this conference. And there is distrust, not just amongst country to country, politics to politics. Politics and industry, citizens, industry, politics, there is a mistrust because we don't talk to each other. We do not want to share what our plans are. We do not want to understand what is required in the planning. When you want to retool a factory, when you want to actually build an industry that none of us, except for the United States really, has been active in building. If we're all in this together, we have to talk about it. We have to be able to communicate. We have to come up with solutions. And at times we have to compromise. If the Netherlands has a great strength, let's use it. If Canada has a great strength, then let's use it. But let's actually understand what our strengths are by talking to each other.
What investments would you make to strengthen democracy? Civics education, history, and service. That's what helps undergird the ability to compromise that Nancy's talking about. My father was a sergeant in the U.S. 1st Infantry. He often said he only really became an American when he was deployed in Germany, responsible for another group of Americans from all different backgrounds and from all over the country. He was a Protestant white kid from Boston, but for the first time in his life, he had people of every background from our nation. Americans who serve at home through AmeriCorps, or who serve abroad through the Peace Corps, or who serve through our military, often find that they learn about themselves and about our nation, and then how to respect each other. So I think we need to ask more of our citizens that they do more service of all kinds. I think we need to assume that we're not educating young people enough in what are the alternatives, because if we are not engaged in dialogue and compromise, the alternative is violence. And so when our political system fails to work effectively, fails to deliver compromise, fails to deliver on simple things from fixing the damn roads to helping grow the economy, then people lose confidence in democracy. But democracy is a verb, not a noun. It is something we have to do and we have to practice. And when we do that, then we help inspire the rest of the world to recognize that our prosperity is rooted in our freedom, which is guaranteed and secured by our democracy.
Yeah, so living the message rather than just transmitting the message to the world in terms of securing democracy. I'm going to turn it to the audience very quickly, but I want to ask you, Minister McGuinty. How do you see, because here we are as a country now involved in creating, or you as a government, about to bring about a military industrial strategy. You're talking about massive investments for this country, as you say, something we have not done for generations. So how do you see Canada doing that in tandem with allies and other democracies? And picking up on Ms. Southern's point, how we support each other's strengths and weaknesses?
Well, the first thing we did was we actually took a long, hard look at what 17 other countries have done. How well has it worked for them? What learnings can we derive? How do we factor that into the design of our own approach for this defense industrial strategy? And along the way, we've continued to build relationships. We continue to do defense agreements. We continue to do trade agreements. The Prime Minister just came back from the United Arab Emirates last night, I think, or is there just on his way in South Africa, announced roughly a $30 billion commitment from the UAE to invest in Canada in different spheres, including defense. So we're going to move forward now and implement, for the first time, let me illustrate. Last week, we had 13 venture capitalists at the table, sitting for the first time across the table from Department of National Defense and Canadian Armed Forces members. It had never happened before. So we're beginning now to introduce this notion that we have to do this together, that we're in this together, that the Canadian Armed Forces presupposes a strong military industrial base that we can work with. We're going to domesticate a certain amount of production based on our sovereign capabilities, our needs. We're going to look at what do we need, what can we do, and what can we sell or share. And so that is the design of that intersection going forward. And it'll involve all kinds of exchanges. Comparative advantage between the Dutch expertise in one field over the Canadian expertise in another. That's how this has been working. Canada is a little later to the dance, but we're here, and we're now going to move on this quite quickly. And it turns out there's a huge pent-up demand to do this. It turns out that many hundreds, if not thousands, of Canadian companies want to get involved. Turns out when we actually create our roughly 10 new classified research hubs, like the one we announced yesterday in Halifax, for maritime research and development, a place where our top-notch government researchers, our top-notch defense researchers can interface with our top-notch private sector researchers, buttressed with banking and venture capital and foreign direct investment from, for example, sovereign wealth funds. We're going to create, we believe, a mechanism through which we're going to give an élan, a momentum, to a whole new industrial sector, an improved industrial sector. That's the Prime Minister's vision for the country. Defense will be one of the top three going forward. And all the work we've done in the last 6 months, which is happening quickly, there seems to be a lot of support. So we're hopeful, but we will be working with our partners.
Okay. With that, I'll open up to the floor. Does anyone we have a question right there, row 2.
Thank you. My name is Alejandro Poiré from Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico. And a number of you have actually addressed this issue, but I want to make it fairly explicit. When we look at democratic backsliding and democratic decay the world over, there is one variable that we cannot get rid of in any specification that we try to address. Why is it that these countries are backsliding? And that is inequality. So the question is, if democracies are to deliver dollars, how can we make sure that we think constantly about ways of implementing economic policy making that are going to address this issue?
The wage gap is a huge issue, and inequality is creating civil unrest. There's no doubt about that. But that's where I say we have actually been lax in our responsibility in democracies. We, government, regulators, judiciary, we need to hold our companies accountable. We need to continuously improve, and we have to modernize our policies, our regulatory systems. We don't invest in our regulators and looking at forward models. Everything is in the past. And we allow businesses to find loopholes in tax. And I personally feel that is businesses should be accountable. Businesses should expect to hold themselves responsible for making sure that the janitor on the factory floor is paid a fair and equitable wage so that he can enjoy the same hopes and dreams for his family as the person sitting in the CEO's chair. And the CEO doesn't have to have, I I hate these things that say this person and this person is the richest person in the world and the next person's the richest person in the world. That does nothing for democracy. So let's hold ourselves accountable. Let's have these conversations and say, how do we fix this? And businesses have to step up. If the minimum wage is too minimum, then we're going to have to find ways to be more efficient, more productive, more imaginative in delivering our products and services. But we each have to actually take that accountability and exercise the responsibility of democracy.
I'm going to jump off on that point. Well taken. Thank you. And that has to do with corporations. But Senator Coons, you were talking a little bit about Belt and Road from the PRC, because that too is a direct challenge. When you talk about global inequity, there's a reason why developing nations turn to the PRC to fund basic infrastructure for them. And you yourself have introduced a program, and this was decades back, or a few years back rather, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. Can you talk about that? Because that does go towards fostering democracies around the world, does it not?
Alejandro, to the point you were making, inequality both within countries and between countries is one of the things that does drive instability, grievance. And frankly, corruption is also one of the things that drives inequality in terms of access to markets and what infrastructure gets built by whom, where. A group of us, Republican, Democrat, House and Senate, passed the bill that created the Development Finance Corporation. President Trump signed it in his first term. 2 entities for development have survived the collapse or the crushing of USAID. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, which was created under George Bush, and the Development Finance Corporation. Both of them seek to make available investment funds for development on equitable terms, more transparent, less debt trap diplomacy, in projects designed in partnership with countries and in ways that deliver development results, not just things that make the leader happy. And that's intended to be in direct competition with other models for investment. And the DFC was designed to be a vehicle that could syndicate with our partners so that we would end up working with the Dutch and the Canadians and the Nordics and the Koreans and Japanese in development projects that were more transparent, more likely to be sustainable, and more likely to have a developmental impact to address inequality.
Minister, I know you want to say something as well.
Alejandro, I think most Canadians believe the government has 2 purposes. First, it gives credence, not credence, it gives shape and form to what the population wants as a people. Through government, it gives expression. I think the second thing most people I speak to after many, many election campaigns is they expect government to be a referee that helps take the rough edges off the free market. There's a reason why Canada has the highest number of women in the OECD participating in the economy. And it has to do with public policy measures which have enabled, facilitated, promoted, assisted women to do so. So I think all of us have to be cognizant that I think it's a foolish jurisdiction that lets human capital slide. I think the notion is we want to identify all of the talent that can be harnessed and deployed. We want to invest in it, and then we want to deploy it. And so I think that's one of the things we're trying to do in Canada. If we look at childcare plans, or we look at childcare benefit, or we look at public health care, or we look at foundational floors that the average citizen stands on, and we made an active decision to agree that letting folks fall too far is a mistake. It's expensive. It creates disembodiment. I can't see myself in this society. I can't participate in this society. And so we're working, I think, actively to say, how do we give folks the support they need while engendering competition and creativity and innovation? So I think that's one of the ways we deal with the challenge that you're talking about. So frankly, a lot of young people don't just check out. It's too complicated. You folks are responsible for this. I don't see myself reflected in this society. It's hopeless and helpless. So I think all of us have to weigh that carefully in the context of our own nation states, in the context of the role that each of our governments play as referee.
And pride.
And pride.
And pride. We have to make our citizens proud of who we are. And we have to cheer for them.
Okay, and we have another question here, middle section, the third row. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Nabe Watanabe from Japan, and I appreciate the Senator Coons pick up China's issues. So, now everybody is now maybe watching to Japan is fighting against China's economic coercion too. And that issue, of course, it's not Japan. Japan experienced several times, and several European countries, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, experienced China's the economic coercion. It didn't work, but it sometimes works. So, and because China has a lot of economic power. For example, recently China canceled 500,000 trip to Japan, according to Chinese government. And that's a big impact to the economy. And sometimes democracies are vulnerable to the people who are frustrated with a very bad economy. I don't know what's happening in Japan, but I'd like to ask your advice. How democracies could work on to prevent such kind of economic coercion?
Hajimemashite. The way that we can work together, and there's actually bipartisan legislation in the Senate to try to address this, is to make sure that our governments have the fiscal space and the legal authority to engage in rapid response where there is economic coercion being used to try and change policies. You referenced when the Australians did things the PRC didn't like. They very abruptly canceled all sorts of orders for everything from lobster tails to wine to beef, and caused really quite rapid harm. The same thing you just cited in Japan. Lithuania, when they decided to open an office for Taiwan for trade, suddenly found itself squeezed. We need to partner amongst democracies, but we also need to deliver short-term rapid relief in terms of buying, so that countries that are being leveraged for strategic advantage don't find themselves unable to sustain their positions. I happen to come from a state that grows a lot of chicken. China was our single biggest export market. When they cut us off, I heard a lot from the chicken farmers of Delaware. How are we going to replace this? China is an enormous market, and they do use market access for leverage. Bluntly, we also in the United States should not use market access to the United States and tariffs in a way to inappropriately leverage our partners. There are inequalities in trade. There are unfair trade practices. We can and should be addressing them. But we leave ourselves vulnerable when we weaken the bonds between our nations that are rooted in free trade, when we engage in those sorts of practices between democracies.
I think
Minister.
I think we should work much harder on reducing dependencies and vulnerabilities towards China. What I've seen in the Netherlands at least, but also in other European countries, is that this urgency has reduced because people were focusing on other things. Sometimes what's happening in Ukraine or the Middle East or other economic turmoil. And then when I talk to companies or other politicians, they say, we know that China is a long-term threat or a long-term challenge, but we have so many things on our mind now, we cannot work on reducing these dependencies. But I think in the longer term, of course, that is not a good approach. We now also have an issue with China with one of our chip manufacturers at this point. And we have seen if you don't work on this, then at some point it will become a big issue. And then second, what we also see is that both companies and governments, they don't want to take up any short-term pain. So they postpone the issue all the time. And that's also the situation that we are in now with when it comes to chips. Of course, if China is not delivering, then you feel the economic consequences. But how long can we endure such a situation? And then we see that China and countries like Russia and others are able to take up much more pain in the short term than we often are. And third, we need to show more solidarity. You mentioned the example, rightly so, of Lithuania. When that happened, Europe was pretty quiet. And there was not much support among European countries. And that's an issue. And it happens quite often that one of the European countries is standing up against China, but then the European Commission, other European countries, they stay silent. And then there is, at the same time, we try to be tough towards China, and at the same time, someone is doing a big trade mission, going there and signing new deals. You know, it doesn't work that way. We need to be much more consistent, much more united, and also show more solidarity.
Mr. McGuinty.
There's no doubt if we stick together, we're much more powerful. If we work together, we're much more powerful. We're stronger together. On China, my experience, I began working in China in 1993. We've all witnessed dramatic transformation. But I always go back to my mother's sage advice. My saintly mother, who said to me on my wedding day, I only have one thing to say to you, son. Same advice she gave all of her 10 kids. Whatever happens during your marriage, keep talking. When it comes to China, we keep talking. Dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. Now, dialogue doesn't mean weakness. Dialogue doesn't mean frankness is abandoned. Dialogue doesn't mean that we're not prepared to call each other out on our transgressions, on our weaknesses, on our conduct. On the contrary, dialogue is very much about respectful presentation of positions. I have a theory that as the world continues to show tremendous stress in terms of the carrying capacity of the planet, I believe that we are going to be catapulted together. We're going to be thrown together in a way that we're not quite aware of as we see the collapse of different systems. I'm not a big, the world is crumbling fan, but when I look at the state of rivers in China, and I look at the fact that Panasonic's building 18-story buildings now that are food walls, because so much of the soil in China is too toxic to grow food in, we're going to see ourselves, I think, thrown together to deal with carrying capacity crises, the loss of DNA, the loss of bioprospecting, the loss of biomimicry, the loss of functioning eco-services and systems, which are going to compromise our ability to survive as a species. The Chinese know this, we know this, and I think it's one of those areas where we can find common ground, where we have to admit that we're going to be dealing with this together. There is only one planet. It's like that famous scene in that movie. What's the car? Risky Business. Porsche, there is no substitute. Nature, there is no substitute. So I like to say there is national security, but there's also natural security. And I believe that our relationship with the Chinese can be improved and built on that front.
Okay. We have one more question. Young man to the left of me.
Hello, I'm Nicholas from Ecuador. Regarding inequality, the previous question also, what should the countries do if the government if it has a conflict of interest, as investment from corporate money or from people that are the ones who have to pay more taxes or under the level of richness to make it more equal for the rest of people, have influenced the people in power, or are the people in power? So what should a country do in that case?
Anybody want to try to tackle that one?
If I understand your point, that is part of the challenge of democracy, is to demand, often through demonstration, through speaking out, through protest, that the system of the democracy of Ecuador or any country, deliver better for everyone. The fundamental principle, the fundamental goal of the state is to deliver security, but in a democracy to also deliver opportunity, and to deliver opportunity in a way that also advances justice. If it is only delivering opportunity for the very richest and best connected, or through corruption, it's not delivering opportunity in a just way. Ultimately, that's the purpose of engagement, of bringing a generation of young and more optimistic and more demanding people into the conversation. The Arab Spring really happened because young Arabs were refusing to accept a future where they had no chance of leading a better life. Most people want a better life for themselves. And just because there's elections doesn't mean there's a democracy. It also requires a free and open market, a system of laws, free opportunities, the ability to worship as you wish, a free press, and many countries that are democratic, they have elections, do not deliver economic justice for their constituents. So I'd urge you to continue to believe in the Ecuador that could be and to not accept the Ecuador that is.
Michael, could I just add to that? Because this is a great opportunity. I have something that I hold close to my heart, the people of our company really work and strive towards, is our definition of excellence. And if we all are working towards excellence, going far beyond the call of duty, doing more than others expect, this is what excellence is all about. It comes from striving, maintaining the highest standards, looking after the smallest detail, and going the extra mile. And excellence means caring. It means making a special effort to do more. And that's really incumbent upon all of us in all of the democracies around the world.
We have 5 minutes left. I'm sorry, I'm gonna cut the questions off here because I want to steal a little bit. I do want to steal the last few minutes to go right down the road, because when you talk about democracies deliver dollars, it's a wide-reaching topic, and we've talked about inequality, messaging, communication, investments in military, working with allies. What is the call to action from each one of you? Under the subheading of democracies deliver dollars, what is the call to action to the people here at the summit? Minister.
Which one?
You. To my right.
It's worth fighting for. It's worth working towards. We're stronger together. I never like to talk about the magnitude of the challenge on anything unless we're prepared to talk about the magnitude of the opportunity inherent in addressing the challenge. I think this planet is breathtaking in its beauty, breathtaking in the gift we have of life, the rich variety, the diversity, who we are, the species. It's unbelievable what we have in front of us. It's a gift. And so I think the message is we redouble, quadruple, quintuple our efforts, come together. We may be 50 or 60 mid-sized countries, a couple of very large countries. It's absolutely wonderful to have our colleagues south of the border here today, this weekend. But the unity of purpose that comes from coming together is available to us. And ultimately, if we build nobility of purpose, why are we doing this? What do we believe in? I think we can do this, and I think we will. I hope that's the message of the weekend.
Minister Brekelmans.
So our enemies and our adversaries, they try to divide us. And we are letting it happen. I think there are too many topics in which we as allies and friends are not standing beside each other, but are standing in front of each other. And we need to make sure that we are united and that we stay close, because we're all facing extremely difficult dilemmas that are putting our societies under pressure. In the Netherlands, we are now thinking about how to increase our defense spending from 2 to 3.5%. And that's going to be a big challenge. It will require some difficult choices. But how do we do this in a way that is not raising inequality further, for example, or that is, for example, raising taxes further so companies are leaving and we will not generate enough dollars. So, and we are all facing these same dilemmas and these same issues, but only if we stand together, work together, make sure that we not only think about our national interest, but our joint interest. I think this is the only way to have democracies in the end outwin, because as we said, at the core, we are much stronger and we can be much more prosperous.
Ms. Southern?
Oh, I completely agree with both ministers, and I know I'll agree with Senator Coons. But conversation, a willingness to compromise, accept and exercise our responsibilities as citizens of democracy. And then I would add pace, pride. We need to engage everybody to feel good about what it is we're accomplishing.
Senator Coons.
Democracy is messy. Democracy is slow moving. Democracy can be frustrating. Democracy can at times fail to deliver. It is the worst system of governance ever devised by man, except for all the rest. And as my country comes upon a 250th celebration of the soaring words written in our Declaration of Independence, but frankly, after the wreckage of the Second World War, broadly embraced by the world, as we reflect on the service and sacrifice of so many Canadians, Dutch, Americans, British, Australians, others who served and fought in a last global cataclysm between democracies and authoritarian states, after which both Japan and Germany joined us as democracies. I think this calls for all of us to reassert our faith. Democracy, at the end of the day, is faith in the spark of the divine in all of us. Whether this is religiously based for you or not, the idea that every single one of us is worthy of respect, to have our own dreams, to take our own initiative, to seek our own future as we see fit, is essentially what democracy is about. It's the system that embodies each of us being created and an equal child of God, or each of us having that spark of the human that deserves expression. So Martin Luther launched the Reformation with a number of principles. One of them was the priesthood of all believers. This moment calls for all of us to be believers in democracy, to be missionaries for democracy, to not just observe it, to not just think about it or talk about it, but as so many of you here have, to actually engage in it with your full faith and character and intensity, and to rededicate yourself to the cause of democracy, without which the next 80 years will not be as free, will not be as prosperous, will not be as hopeful. I think a lot about my not yet born grandchildren, who my wife and I pray for all the time, and about which we will be pressuring our children at Thanksgiving. I want my grandchildren to live in a free society where they are free to find their way in the world. And I am so grateful to our Canadian, Dutch, and other brothers and sisters from around the world who continue to be committed to democracy alongside us. Thank you.
Minister David McGuinty of Canada, Minister Ruben Brekelmans of the Netherlands, Senator Chris Coons of the United States, Ms. Nancy Southern, thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you, Michael.